Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and record our session today. I want to welcome everyone. I hope your first week of classes went well. On to week 2 and getting an inching closer really to the career fair. And I'm happy to have you all here today. My name is Lauren Little, and I am a career coach with Kelley, Indianapolis Career Services. And today what we're going to be doing is a first part of our 30-minute career webinar series about how to design your resume in Microsoft Word. And what we're going to focus on really is the formatting aspect of it. And so that's what the tips are going to be really focused on, especially when we're looking at what is called applicant tracking systems, which is just a smart resume reviewer which scans your resume to determine whether or not you're fit for the position that you've applied for, whether or not you meet the criteria. So we won't really be covering a ton about writing the content. And if you have questions about that, I want you to shoot me an email. I've got my email address in the chat box there. And I'll be throwing some various links into the chat box throughout today's session, but you're also welcome to ask any questions during our session today. And we are going to be kicking off here right now. So let's run into it. So just to give you a heads up, I am using Microsoft Word to show you all of the different system aspects, but you can certainly utilize things like documents on Google. So that will be an option for you. I just want to be aware of any Mac users. If you use Pages, that does not open on PCs. And so you might have a problem with that reader being available to people. When we talk about the ATS system, as I mentioned before, why do we actually care about this? Well, this is the resume, let's say, that you submit to an applicant tracking system, and this is actually what the system does to it. So the ATS system goes through and it starts parsing out information. So it goes through and it looks at job titles and it looks at years of experience, locations where you might have been. You can also see on some of these different candidate profiles, they're actually even parsing out relevant skills that are embedded within the text that you have. So that's why we care so much about that, because it actually ranks these different candidates. You can see that up here at the top where Margaret Smith has a 9-point match out of a 10-point score. And so she might be called in for an interview. And good formatting means that the system can read this information and properly file it into the system where it's supposed to go. Bad formatting is what happens when an ATS system can't read it and can't find it, and therefore you rank very low on a score in an ATS system. And we'll look at some different ways to format the resume in order to make sure you're hitting all of those targets there. And it's not always about the ATS system, because a beautifully designed resume also works twofold, right? It's for the human side as much as it is for the computer to read it. And I'm going to show you some different resume reading styles that appeal to people as much as it appeals to the different ATS systems out there. And this is also something just to realize when you give a resume to a recruiter at a career fair, or you share it with a colleague, the more that you can help them find information fast, the better that your formatting has been, and that they're able to then talk to you more about a potential interview. So we're going to look at the first 3 things here, which is spacing, margins, and font, to get our document all set up and make sure everything's ideal. And the reason I talk about spacing first is because when you open a blank Word document, you don't automatically get single spacing, and single spacing is actually the best way to get full control over your document. You'll often see resume templates that don't follow this, and the reason I'll have you do this is so that you can create your own document, and that way your experiences actually match what your needs are. Templates are really designed with somebody else in mind. They're not for you, so therefore they're really hard to customize here. Now, if you do find design elements on a resume template that you like, you can incorporate those into your resume, and the single spacing is the first way that that's going to be possible for you to do with the full control. So when you're in Microsoft Word, up at the top in the styles box, you're going to notice something that says normal, which actually has double spacing in it. And then you're going to want to select no spacing, which is going to make sure that you get these single spaces that has, like it's appeared over here on the screen. And that will make sure that you have as much control as you can over the document. Now, the other piece that's really helpful when you're designing a resume is to actually see the different spacing while you're designing it. because sometimes Microsoft Word likes to do funky things to our spacing or how we're actually doing design work. And we have to go in and figure out what it is it's doing. So up in the top, in the paragraph function, you'll see that little paragraph feature up here in that top right below review. And that means these little paragraph guys appear here. You can also see every bit of spacing that happens. And I'm often opening this up just to make sure I can see where there might be things like page breaks that I need to get rid of, or if I'm doing too many tabs over or different spacing things. It helps the designing process. And just a heads up, this does not show up on a printed copy of your resume, so it doesn't affect it at any point. Now the other feature too, just to give you a heads up, there is a ruler feature, so that way you can also make sure things are even on your document, especially when you're trying to make sure that things are aligning the way you want. And I like that view tab. If you go up into there, you can see the ruler. You can even put grid lines on it if you wanted to get so far into making sure that the document had clean lines everywhere you were going. So most people don't realize that you can actually adjust the margins on your document. And all of our word processing softwares are actually set to 1-inch margins. So I want everyone to go into their Microsoft Word and actually explore the ways that you can change margins. I always say you can go about as narrow as about 0.5 inch or half an inch on all sides. Now realize if you go outside of that, you're usually outside of a printed margin, so you may have issues if you do print the document. But the other issue you tend to run into is that it looks like there's text from top to bottom, so you have to also appeal to the reader. So making sure there's a nice balance of white space in addition to making sure you're utilizing the full space is really important. I always joke that you don't want to be the person that has text from top to bottom, then the reader automatically is kind of annoyed because they have to read through so much, and you don't want your name associated with being annoying. So this is how we're going to make sure that we have as much usable space and also the white space on there. And this is a good example of somebody who has utilized the half-inch margins, and it's very clean. You can see on all sides, it's not overwhelming. They've used spacing really nice. And we'll actually look at that a little bit later on the different spacing features. But notice that it's not overwhelming and you get as much space out of it as possible. In fact, in most cases, you're able to add an extra experience onto your resume that you wouldn't have been able to do before. Now, font styles is another really important part of this document. And font styles really helps tell a story, and it also conveys some personality and of course the professionalism that comes with it. And we want to be able to convey that, but in a way that also makes us stand out. So the different font styles that I encourage you to look at are sans serif and then just serif font. And the font that can be, if a font's difficult to read or maybe it doesn't reflect the job you're applying for, it really could leave a bad taste in the recruiter's mouth, especially if they're not aware of it. Oftentimes we look at font styles and kind of have biases towards them. In fact, there was a study that was done at Wichita State University that said that respondents associated fonts like Times New Roman and Arial with stability, someone that really knew what they were doing. Courier New and even Georgia meant that there was maturity in the participant's mind. So those different categories of sans serif and serif fonts are really great in portraying that. So feel free to pick fonts from that category. The ones I really encourage you to stay away from are the ones that are kind of fancy, right? I call these, you know, cursive or maybe even what we call a fantasy font that maybe have a unique theme. And while they're really pretty, you have to be careful about utilizing these because oftentimes they're hard to read for people. And we don't always know who's going to be reading our resume, and we don't ever want to assume someone's eyesight, and that could then, of course, take us out of the running because someone can't read a resume. So be well aware of those. Those can be saved for other uses, maybe outside of designing a resume. And I'm just going to check here and see if we got any comments in the chat. We're looking good so far. So I had talked prior about we want to utilize modern day resume reading patterns. And I call these reading patterns because it's true about how you read a web page as much as how you read a book, that you read a resume almost identical. And so the first one we're going to look at here is something called the F-shape reading pattern. And you can kind of see how the F-shape reading pattern actually plays out here. So for example, the person starts off up at the top left corner and they read straight across, and then they're going back down again and reading straight across. And this person has designed their resume in such a way where they're guiding the person to follow this F-shaped pattern by the headers, and also by these different lines that they have dividing the experience. I'll show you what those look like later. But this is how we draw attention, right? And it's how we get the recruiter to find the most relevant information without wasting time. And that's where the well-formatted resume takes into consideration these different reading patterns, especially when you realize that we are a society that reads left to right. So I do encourage you to format your resume and your headers really to be more left justified. And that's just over here on the side. So that way the resume is read more naturally and they're not having to dart around in order to find information. We're going to look at some other ways too to kind of polish some of these styling things that you're seeing in this particular resume, because what's really nice is this person's also used bolds, they use italics, they've been able to draw attention in other ways, but taking into account how do people actually read these resumes. So the borders feature is one of my favorites here, and this is the way you can actually create different lines. Now, of course, we all know a lot about the lines feature, that you can actually drop one in to the document, but then you also constantly have to move it around as your text kind of shifts from line to line if you're adding additional content. The reason I like borders so much is that you don't have to worry about that line shifting, because it is a line that's directly underneath the text. And so a couple of good examples from the previous experience that I showed you is putting a line underneath the name and then putting lines underneath education. You can format them in different ways, but these are some common ways that you can utilize them in order to help draw attention to your different sections. And so when you're in Microsoft Word, this is what that looks like. So we're just in the paragraph function, and you can see the different borders. You can actually make whole boxes if you wanted to. I happen to just like using the bottom border because it's clean. It's something that's very simple and it's classic. So that's a nice thing to have on a resume to show professionalism. But feel free to utilize, some of the thicker borders. They have different horizontal line borders. You can see the different possibilities in creating something that looks unique to you and what kind of speaks to your style as well. All righty. And I got a comment here in the chat. Oh, so this is a good one. So someone was asking, how do I format different dates in my resume? So let's say I started an internship at one point and now I'm coming back to it. You can actually list those dates separately as you had those different experiences. So you might have it associated with a job title and have the month and date associated with it directly with the job title. You can also put one directly underneath it and just show the different months where you started and ended, and then your next start and end date. That always helps convey that to an employer. Good question. Let me know if that answered it. So another functionality I want to show you guys is how you can actually stack information, so that way you can create these almost like faux columns, so that way you have as much space utilized on the resume, but then you're also not taking yourself out of the ATS system, which actually can't read when we put columns into the system. So let me show you a little bit about what that looks like. So this is actually an example I pulled from a resume where this person has multiple certificates. So this is 6 different certificates, and to have 6 different lines that just take up a huge chunk of space is not really the best use of space when we have maybe all of this white hanging out over here on the side. So what we did was actually just created 2 columns, and we just tabbed over. So you can actually see where I use that paragraph function in order to help line things up. And we added all of these experiences. So really it only took up 3 lines, and we didn't have to use that columns feature. Now, you do have the ability to use columns, but ATS systems cannot read them. So if you've ever done that before, where you've highlighted a list of the different, like a long list of text, and then you've tried to break it into 2 columns, the ATS system can't read what's over here on the right side of the column. And so that can be a disadvantage if some of your certificates need to be read, because as the ATS system reads, it's going to be left to right. So it doesn't miss any of these here. So it just goes straight across. And it's an efficient way to utilize your space. So therefore you're not having to cut anything or leave anything off the resume. And I've actually done that here with a student for 2 different softwares. We did it under a certificates and also under a softwares and technologies. The top is what it looks like if you're utilizing the paragraph function, so you can utilize or see the different tabs over. But right below it is what it actually looks like if you take that off. So it looks clean, really easy to read. Now, I mentioned this already, but ATS systems are a little funky. Sometimes they don't read everything on a resume. The other thing that I think is a great thing to know is that not only do columns not work, but the other thing you have to be very careful of is not utilizing text boxes. Text boxes just float above the document. They're kind of like this little raft, and you can't see anything on it when an ATS system goes through and scans. So if you submit anything on your resume that has a text box, the system won't read it. It'll just be blank. And I've seen people's resumes go through an ATS system where nothing was viewed because they had their whole resume in a text box. So stay away from those. You don't want to be left out of a pool just because your resume wasn't read. Now that sample that we looked at when we looked at the F-shaped reading pattern utilized this really well, and it's the bolds, italics, utilizing underlines. And the reason we do this is that this is the human side of things, right? So the ATS system doesn't really care if something's bold or highlighted, but I do, or the recruiter does, because it's visually appealing and it tells me where my eye needs to go on my resume. And that's what we're going to look at next, is the different things that you can utilize. So the first thing is we're going to bold section headers. That can be things like your education section. It could be your work experience section. And we can also even do a little bit more and increase the font size of these particular headers. So that way we're drawing importance. Maybe I went on a study abroad trip, so therefore I'd want to make those section headers bigger because maybe that makes me unique. The other thing too, we already talked about making sure things are left aligned, so that way it aligns with that reading pattern versus being in the center where it's not as natural to view. So here's a good example of someone with an education section where they bold and italicize things. So in this case, it all depended upon what the student wanted to emphasize. In this case, the position they were applying to had a bunch of Kelley School of Business alumni that were working there. So what we did was we highlighted the institution because that was important, because they seemed to have a track record of hiring Kelley students. Now, that being said, you might decide that you want to highlight maybe your degree because that is what you are noticing is a requirement or that's going to help you stand out. The same could be done for majors or even GPA. The idea is not to over bold or over italicize, but pick what makes sense to emphasize, and it's all based upon what you're applying to. Now, here's an example of what it looks like if we didn't do anything with it. And from a recruiter standpoint, I'm kind of bored, number one, but number two, when you're looking at these work experiences, it doesn't really tell me what's exciting or where I should be drawing my attention to other than where the line is, that border that we created. So on here, we might change this up and we might try this. So as an example, I've bold work experience. I decided I was going to bold the company. Maybe it's because I was a former intern there and now I'm applying to a full-time role. I want to really emphasize that. They've italicized their job title, again, making it a little bit interesting. And in this case too, the other thing they've done is bolded the dates because they wanted to show when they were there. And that could certainly be important, especially if it's someone who has been there recently. Now, sometimes you can use underlines. I will say that underlines aren't as common because you're going to be using the borders feature. And that's the most efficient feature because borders actually goes from one side of the document to the other with the margins you already have set. Now, when you're utilizing underlines, you have to constantly be adjusting these because your borders may have become longer or shorter. And so therefore you're having to make a lot of unnecessary adjustments that the borders feature automatically does for you. So don't worry too much about utilizing underlines unless it makes sense in a particular situation. I've seen people underline particular things like software program titles that they had utilized in a particular bullet point to help draw emphasis to it. That's always an acceptable way to use it. So there's different ways to make people pay attention to things. Now, another design feature, and it really comes into play when we're talking about how your resume needs to be viewable to your audience, is utilizing numeric values versus actually spelling something out. So I've given the example, utilizing the numbers 50 and percent versus writing out 50%. And this is a way that we're drawing attention to particular pieces that showcase the scope of our work. And it's just because numbers actually stand out. They are adding variety to what you're showcasing on the document. And the other thing that's important is it's showing an outcome. If you're looking at a document and you see nothing but text, there's nothing that's going to excite you to go to a particular section. But if I see that you managed a budget of $2,000 and that's in a numeric value, my eye goes straight there. So we're kind of being strategic in the way that we're showcasing these different experiences. And I've given you an example here. The bottom one is obviously much easier for you to read, and you can all be excited about that because you see the 100% compliance. That's a really neat achievement that this person has had. But also realize that this took that person down from having a 2-line bullet point down to 1 line. So it also saved them space, which is good. Some of us may be fighting for space on resumes, and here's a good way to cut a little bit out. Now, this question I get somewhat frequently about whether or not I should be using graphics or putting pictures on resumes. I will say a couple of things. First of all, pictures and graphics do not get read by ATS systems. So you could have a very beautifully designed document that doesn't actually have anything that comes through if you decide to use like an email icon as an example, or a LinkedIn icon. The system won't read it. But I will say that you might utilize some more graphically designed resumes when you're networking, because as someone who's viewing a document, that will make a difference to me, right? Because I can see those, it's kind of a nice visual element. There's other things you have to be taking into consideration. Some industries do not like graphics at all. So as an example, some more traditional industries like accounting and finance are not big fans of that. In fact, a lot of them will say they just want to have the more traditional resume. So you may have multiple different versions of the resume that have the same content, but is designed just a little bit differently. Now, if you are in the the advertising area, graphic design, anything that has a design element to it, those industries value that, but it's because of what kind of skill set you're showing with the resume and the design eye that they're actually looking for. So just be aware of that. It can help you as much as it could hinder you based upon what you're doing with it. All righty. And let's just say this, that 30 minutes goes by really fast. So what I'm going to do now is open up the chat if you have any questions. I'm going to double check here too in our Q&A just to make sure we don't have any. There's a couple of events coming up too. So first of all, on September 3rd and September 8th, we have 15-minute resume reviews happening. You'll have links in your email and also in the Kelley student portal and the pre-business student portal. So you can come in and see a Kelley coach like myself, and we'll walk through this with you. Be sure to employ some of the tips that we've talked about here. Those are always nice to be able to see. In addition, there's a couple of other opportunities coming up. In fact, Friday, we're going to have a webinar on how to succeed in virtual career fairs. We're going to have a couple of employers who are going to join us, in addition to actually walking through the system itself so you can see what a virtual career fair looks like. And then on September 9th, we're going to talk about how to talk to recruiters. So what does that professional story and that pitch look like as well? So don't forget to check that Kelley Career Edge email, in addition to also where it is in the Canvas pages. And of course, one last thing, we also have virtual drop-ins. So tomorrow you can talk to us between 10 and 12, Wednesday 11 to 1, and Friday 1 to 3 p.m. And that is available on kelleycareersonline.com. You just click chat with us. But I'm going to go ahead and hang out here for another couple minutes while we get wrapped up. But thank you so much for joining us today on our second 30-minute career webinar. I hope you had a great day. Happy Monday.